Hello everyone, this is my specialized project presentation for ED535. I am a secondary English education major here at Southeast Missouri State University, so when looking at the options for specialized projects, I came up with the idea of doing something similar to what we do in education, which is a philosophy of teaching. But I wanted to provide an emphasis on trauma informed practices. So we will be discussing my philosophy of teaching and how trauma affects that philosophy. So, for an overview of what we will be discussing today, I will first tell you what kind of teacher I want to be, as well as give you an overview of what trauma responsive teaching is, what I have learned that will help me in the classroom, as well as how I plan to follow the steps that researchers have suggested when I have been learning about this. So, to begin, I'd like to give you an idea of the type of teacher I have dreamed of being. I've always wanted to be a teacher. Both my parents are educators, and so I like to say that it runs in my blood. I used to play pretend as a teacher all the time with my Barbies and stuff, so I'm kind of fulfilling that childhood dream. And when I imagine myself as a teacher, I think of a documentary that I watched in my trauma and resiliency course called Paper Tigers. In this documentary movie, I witnessed several teachers who were similar to how I want to be as a teacher. Um, they show teachers who supported their students, listened to their students, told their students they loved them, practiced culturally responsive teaching, collaborated with other teachers and school administrators, and that's also what I want to do. And I think part of the reason why I enjoyed the documentary so much was because I was witnessing teachers who shared some similar practices as what I want to do. Um, I think many teachers hope to be the best teacher or the favorite teacher. I know that in my personal experience, like I said, both my parents are educators, and I've grown up hearing that, oh, your dad was my favorite teacher. Oh, your mom was my favorite professor. And as much as would love to be that, as much as I would love to aspire to be that, I just want to be the type of teacher that can make someone's day just a little bit better. One of the things that I mentioned that the educators in the Paper Tigers movie did was tell their students that they love them. And this is something that I have tried to do already in my field experiences as a teaching candidate, because I think it is important to hear that someone cares about you, loves you, thinks that you're important at least once a day. And unfortunately, not every student is going to hear that from someone when they go home. So they might as well hear it at least once while they're at school. And I'm sure there will be days where I don't like my students, but I'll always love them. I mean, even now, I haven't been a professional teacher yet. I've only been doing field experience, and I already have so much love in my heart for those students. And I want to continue that. As well, here are some adjectives I would like to hear when someone is trying to describe my teaching. So, I want to be collaborative. I think that it is always important to share your ideas and hear ideas from other people. So, I want to even hear that from my students as well as other teachers, administrators, etc. I want to be consistent. So, I don't want to just get into, especially when it comes to discipline. I don't want to discipline one student differently than I would another. I want to address each situation and discipline it the same every time. I also kind of want to not make it to where my students have to guess what kind of mood Miss Clubs is going to be in that day. Because a lot of them may already be doing that at home. What kind of mood is my mom in? What kind of mood is my dad in? What kind of mood is my sister, whatever. I kind of want to try my best to be consistent in that. I want to be described as warm, welcoming, greeting them at the door, asking them about the various sports games and stuff. I try my best to be understanding. I know that sometimes it can be really frustrating when students aren't necessarily doing exactly what you want them to do. But I want to be more understanding and come from a perspective where I know that they could be doing it for other reasons and not just to annoy me. I want to be patient. I am not the most patient person, but I think being a teacher, that's definitely a skill that you learn. And I also want to be motivational. I want to tell them good luck at their track meet, their basketball games, etc. I want to give them some motivation before they take a test or write a paper, etc. How do I do that though? Because that's all good in theory, but I think eventually it can sound kind of impossible. I think, especially for people who have been teaching for a while, when they hear that that's what I want to do, they're like, oh, that's cute. You think that you can do that. Practice. I'm gonna practice. I'm gonna take it one day at a time. I'm gonna try to have patience, like I said, with my students, but also with myself. And I'm going to have a good therapist. I currently have a good therapist, but if I were to be a teacher in a different state where I wouldn't have the same therapist that I have now, I'll find one and I'll go to therapy and I'll keep going to therapy because I think that teachers are some of the people who need therapy the most. Although I argue everybody needs therapy, 10 out of 10 would recommend. All right, so I'm also going to use the skills that I learned in my research through ED535, which talks about being trauma responsive, trauma informed. But what does that mean? What have I learned, and how am I going to apply it to my teaching? So, trauma occurs when the psychological distress caused by a deeply disturbing or chronically stressful event overwhelms one's ability to cope. There is acute stress, which can be a temporary kind of thing, but still is just as traumatizing. For example, the of a caregiver, a natural disaster, etc. Or there's chronic trauma, which is an ongoing thing. So, historical and systemic racism is obviously traumatic, and something that we are sadly seeing, especially in communities during the pandemic with like Black Lives Matter, and stuff like that. But that's a whole different topic. And then trauma responsive is a study specifically in classrooms, although I also read an article about how they've been, especially with that racism piece, how museum uh, educators and that type of thing have started to use trauma responsive practices in museums, which was really interesting, as well as like libraries and stuff like that. But a team of educators, counselors, and researchers and neuroscientists, excuse me, recently developed a framework for addressing trauma in schools that's known as trauma responsive educational practices, or TREP. And it's rooted in the neurobiology of how trauma affects the brain and behavior, and how a trauma responsive learning environment and pedagogy can help teach how to identify and support young individuals coping with trauma, and then also how to help educators who are helping their students cope, because secondary trauma is a thing. When you are interacting with educators who have been helping students through their traumatic experiences, that can take a toll on the individual as well. And we'll get into that a little bit more later on. So, a common thing that you're going to hear discussed in trauma related practices are adverse childhood experiences, also known as ACEs. So, this can be described as abuse, whether it's physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, as well as physical and emotional neglect, and then household dysfunction. For example, caregivers having mental illness, an incarcerated relative, um, individuals seeing their mother be treated violently, or their parents and caregivers going through divorce, as well as substance abuse being present in the home. And it is estimated that nearly half of all children in the United States have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. And maybe as you're listening to this presentation, you're realizing that you yourself have experienced adverse childhood experiences, but we won't we won't share those. And it's important to note that not all experiences of trauma lead to a traumatic response or trauma related disorder or diagnosis. However, schools often will start to identify that an individual has experienced trauma when a student is demonstrating aggressive behavior, because trauma significantly alters our brain's function, and it can affect development, which will also affect executive function. Students will struggle with concentration. A lot of students who have experienced trauma will often be diagnosed with deficit hyperactivity disorder. Because they're struggling with concentration and executive function, as well as decision making and memory and stuff like that. So, another important component is race. So, let's talk about race a little bit. It's important for educators to realize unconscious racial biases that can influence interactions with the student, especially because the same behavior can be interpreted differently depending on if a white student is doing the said behavior or if a black student is. And for any organization to become truly trauma informed, you're going to have to dismantle racism, because this is the only way that historical traumas experienced by children and their families can be addressed. And that's when you get into cultural responsive teaching, which means that you use students' customs, characteristics, experiences, and perspectives as tools for better classroom instruction. So, unfortunately, due to the way that our society is today and has historically been, individuals who are racially diverse are going to unfortunately be more likely to experience those adverse childhood experiences, and thus are going to experience more traumatic experiences, which can, as we know, alter the way that they behave. And that can be interpreted incorrectly, and thus disciplined incorrectly. So that's why it's really important to consider race when talking about trauma informed practices. So, in one article that I read, it talked about the National Child Traumatic Stress Network identifying components of trauma informed schools. And so some of those are identifying and assessing traumatic stress, addressing and treating that, just being educated and aware about trauma, creating partnerships with children and families as a school network, as well as creating a trauma informed learning environment, that cultural responsive piece that we just talked about, as well as emergency management and crisis response, because as we talked about, there is acute trauma, which can occur when there is an emergency or a crisis. And thus, it's important that we know how to handle that so that way we can properly address the previous people who may not have been affected by any type of trauma are now going to be experiencing it. And then there's also staff self-care and secondary traumatic stress. So making sure that the individuals who are handling students who have experienced trauma are also taking care of themselves, as well as having proper school discipline policies and practices and cross-system collaboration and community partnerships that can all help with the response to those traumas. All right. So, traditional discipline can increase a sense of vulnerability and result in escalation, but trauma responsive discipline prioritizes maintaining student dignity and ensuring that disciplinary interactions strengthen student self regulation. So, rather than just discipline someone in the moment and tell them not to do that again, we're going to provide them with strategies that can help them not experience this same situation again. So, just based off the options that you see in this purple box, what do you think the better option is in discipline? Emotionally reactive response or developmentally responsive approach? If you guessed developmentally responsive, you are correct. So, let's talk about that a little bit more. Who have experienced unsupportive environments in their lifetime outside of school are often more likely to experience an environment within school that is defeating, which can create this endless cycle of frustrations and negative relationships with teachers and the school. And that comes from a lack of consistency. So, our goal for educators, especially mine, is to create this source of consistency to break said cycle. So we talked about emotionally reactive versus developmentally responsive. So, excuse me, emotional reactive would be something, so an incident would happen and that would trigger your emotions. And often your immediate response to that, due to those heightened events, is going to create a more negative reaction. And it's going to be possibly more intense than what is warranted in that said situation, which can thus make the situation worse. Whereas if you're developmentally responsive, you can acknowledge that what you are experiencing is a situation where your emotions have been triggered and that you're feeling negative about a situation, but you acknowledge and work to change your response. So rather than that immediate reaction and response, you're going to take a second to separate yourself so you can respond in a way that is more supportive of the student and thus is not going to escalate and would rather de-escalate. But I know that's difficult. So there are a few ways to do this. Um, One of the ways is to be more proactive. So based on past behavior of a student, you can plan ahead to how you could better address a situation the next time it happens. Positive behavioral corrections would be reinforcement rather than punishment, because we have seen that punishment is not as nearly as effective as positive reinforcement. Be relational. Expectations are an act of care rather than compliance. So when you're talking to your students about the different expectations that you have, explain why they matter, and it's not you just being a tough administrator. There's a reason behind everything, and talk about that. And it's not just, I need you to do this because I said so. It's I care about you, so therefore we should do this together. And then instructional discipline strategies, learning experience opportunities rather than a lecture. Get them hands on, get them moving, because if they get bored, they have a tendency to act out. So, trauma responsive schools increase students' coping skills and graduation rates, which also improves attendance, classroom behavior, and emotional and physical safety. And trauma responsive schools have seen a decrease in incidents of physical aggression, office discipline referrals, and out of school suspensions, which is all data that we like as educators. So, how does all of that tie into that dream of the kind of teacher I want to be? So, we have 4 steps with my plan. During interviews with a future school district, I want to ask a lot of questions about their disciplinary efforts, the support of their staff, and the collaboration between staff members, because these are important characteristics of a trauma responsive school. And thus, if they don't have the answer I'm looking for, probably not going to consider that school. For the first day of school, once I am in the classroom, I want to set those consistent expectations from my students, which can help establish a routine and then foster an environment for building relationships and trust, because it's going to have that consistency that students crave. I want to regularly attend professional development, whether it's school provided, conferences, lectures, whatever I can get. I want to continue researching, collaborating, and learning, and then share what I learn with my coworkers and take it a step further in that aspect of collaboration. I want to practice self reflection on what I'm doing, brainstorm each year on what I could do better, and practice self care to avoid burnout or compassion fatigue. So we're going to kind of work backwards, and we're going to start with that burnout piece, because I know you're probably thinking about that. So there are 3 key dashboard lights for burnout, and that includes emotional exhaustion, depersonalization, and reduced personal accomplishment. So starting with that emotional exhaustion piece, that measures feelings of being emotionally overextended and exhausted by one's work. And once you start to feel that, you could really dread going to work. And teaching is my dream, so I really don't want that to happen. So there's a couple ways to kind of recharge from that situation. I used the gas tank light for your dashboard light for knowing that you need to refuel. So you can connect with friends and family, focus on better sleeping habits, talk with a therapist. Always gonna shout out therapy. Get moving. Consider joining a group, whether it's a hobby, group therapy, etc. And then with the stress inventory, you are able to collect data to solidify next steps for how you can avoid getting exhausted again in that burnout stage. With depersonalization, that measures feeling of impersonal response towards recipients of one's instructions. So um, a lot of times when talking about education and then also being a parent, depersonalization can be when you've been in that routine for so long that it kind of becomes your only identity. Whether you're just a parent or just a teacher, you don't really have anything that's like personal anymore. So some ways to avoid that is to interact with other staff members instead of just teenagers or just kindergartners throughout the day. That can kind of bring some of yourself back, is interacting with people your own age. Avoid isolation, get plenty of sleep, and create work-life boundaries. Find those things in your life that you enjoy so that way you're not just focused on work and working. And then reduce personal accomplishment measures feelings of competence and successful achievements in one's work. So if you're starting to find that you have a hard time believing that you can bring value to the work that you do, or that you're making any contributions, that's when you can start to notice like, hey, something's not going on here. If you feel like you're inadequate or when you're at work, you find yourself feeling angry or anxious or that you're not satisfied and find a desire to leave, you could be starting to feel, again, that reduced personal accomplishment. So take a second to acknowledge that that's what you're feeling and work to kind of hype yourself up a bit. You know, if you've won any awards at school or a student gave you a letter complimenting you or something, kind of use that to ground yourself, bring yourself back, hype yourself up, and know that you do make a difference. Um, so when I talk about wanting to plan clear expectations, routines, and boundaries, I know a lot of classes will have classroom rules. This is one I just found on Google. And so by setting these clear expectations from the beginning, that can let students know exactly what is expected for them when they're when they're in my classroom. And so, even if they have a whole bunch of different classrooms with different expectations, if I set it from day one that this is what I want in my classroom, they'll always have that piece of consistency. Then, when it comes to routines, I know that I want to have time where students write. So, whether that's a bell ringer or just something that's at the beginning of class with different prompts, that'll be consistent and that they'll always have something to do when they come into class. And then I know that whenever they leave, I want to say that I love them. So, there's kind of two bookends there with consistency at the beginning of class and at the end of class. Um, In Sharon Hoover's article during my research, she provided resources for trauma informed care. So here's a couple of them: the Framework for Safe and Successful Schools, ACEs Connection, National Center for School Mental Health, Futures Without Violence, the School Health Assessment and Performance Evaluation, Educational and School Climate Surveys, the Treatment and Services Adaptation Center, Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. These are all different organizations, websites, etc., that provide resources for educators who are trying to be more trauma informed and trauma responsive. And then that first piece that I mentioned is a interview. So this screenshot that I have on the slide is actually more geared towards a administrator asking a teacher, but I believe that it could go both ways. So I could ask my interviewer what they believe the key components of a trauma-informed school are, and what kind of training they provide for teachers, how they plan to de-escalate a student, ways that they want to intervene, and just those different supports that they have already in the school. And if they can't answer those questions, if they look at me like they have no idea what I'm talking about, or if they provide answers that, quite frankly, I don't find satisfactory, not going to consider that school. Simple as that. Because I'd rather ask about it up front than get into the school and start forming connections with students just to find out that I don't have the support that I want from administration, because I believe that that is just as important as the pay benefits or the location, etc. So, while I have not yet stepped into a classroom as a professional, the education I have received has definitely prepared me for the challenge of teaching in a trauma responsive way. While I don't necessarily see myself working specifically in a school like the one I mentioned in Paper Tigers, where a lot of the students are experiencing things and are going to that school for the reason that they are struggling, I want to bring my education to any of the schools that I go to. I look forward to having the opportunity to put the research and skills I've learned into action when I do get into a classroom. And I appreciate that this area of research of trauma responsiveness is still being researched because, quite frankly, I love learning about it. I've had so much fun researching it and trying to figure out how I could be um, putting this to work and practicing what I've learned, because it is really interesting, and maybe that makes me nerdy or weird to find trauma interesting. But I really feel like this area can help you build those connections with students, which is my main goal. Um, so I really look forward to seeing my philosophy play out in the classroom and continue learning and collaborating with other educators. So, if you have any questions about my presentation about my philosophy of teaching in regards to trauma and resiliency, I've included my CMO email on this slide, so feel free to reach out. I would love to talk with you about it and answer any questions that you may have. And since this is part of my final project at the end of my fall semester and we are in December, I want to be sure to wish you all a happy holidays. Even though I know that the holidays can sometimes be a rough season for people, I hope you find some joy and light in this time of year. Thank you so much for listening to my presentation, and I hope you have a wonderful day.